Relations between the United States and China will face a new test as officials from both sides meet in Alaska. The discussions are expected to be frosty, with Beijing warning that compromise is not on the cards. Live to Olivia Seong and Simon Marks in a moment, but first, a look at what to expect from the talks.
An icebreaker to thaw increasingly tense relations. The stage is set in Alaska for a first face-to-face meeting between China and the Biden administration. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan will meet with China's top foreign policy officials Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi. There's no guarantee of any breakthroughs, with both sides playing down expectations.
当然，我们并不指望一次对话就能解决中美之间的所有问题。 所以我们对这次对话也没有什么过高的期待或者说幻想。
Tough discussions are anticipated over trade, human rights, and the South China Sea. Beijing has warned it will not back down on key issues like Xinjiang and Hong Kong. The Biden administration has called engagement with China the biggest geopolitical test of the 21st century. But there remains hope for some common ground between the world's two largest economies. They include areas like climate change and pressuring North Korea over its nuclear program.
Olivia Seong joins us live now from Beijing. Olivia, Beijing appears cautious going into these talks.
Yeah, we're just hearing news that the Chinese officials have arrived in Alaska as both sides, China and the U.S., continue to play down expectations of the outcome of these meetings. And today, China's foreign ministry did say that at its daily briefing that it doesn't expect all problems with the U.S. to be solved at one meeting, and how much progress the two countries can make will very much depend on efforts from both sides and whether or not we see any positive results or outcomes from these sessions. Now, according to China's ambassador to the U.S., Cui Tiankai, he said that expectations from China are not high and it would be considered successful if some sort of rational, constructive dialogue can be forged. And this really points to how far apart China and the U.S. are, as we've seen a deterioration in ties over the last few years, particularly under the Trump administration, and seeming to continue into this new Biden administration, with both sides clashing over numerous issues, whether it's trade, technology, or human rights issues as well. And the backdrop that these meetings are taking place under is also extremely tense. The Biden administration has pretty much signaled a tough line. It has the U.S. officials just completing their visits to its ally countries, Japan and South Korea, where they had called out China for aggression and what it said was coercion to erode, for example, autonomy in Hong Kong. And China's foreign ministry once again hitting back at this, saying that the U.S. microphone diplomacy and forming of cliques to pressure China ahead of the Alaska meetings are useless. And this also comes on the back of U.S. action that we've seen against China, one of them being the extra sanctions on Chinese mainland and Hong Kong officials over their role in eroding freedoms in Hong Kong. And China has already said that it has imposed the necessary countermeasures for this. And what we do know is that China is going to make clear its position. It has repeatedly said that there are red lines that cannot be crossed. And some of these include issues over Taiwan, Hong Kong, as well as alleged human rights abuses in Xinjiang, all of which China considers its internal affairs and it doesn't want to see the U.S. meddling in it. We also could potentially expect China to ask the U.S. to roll back some of the policies that have been implemented under the Trump administration. Previously, we had seen Foreign Minister Wang Yi, who is going to be at those talks, call for the U.S. to roll back some of the tariffs on Chinese goods as well as sanctions on Chinese companies.
And Olivia, China has also dismissed reports that this might pave the way for a leaders' meeting.
Yes, in fact, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, when asked about what the agenda would be, they did say that both sides can discuss any issue of common interest, including high-level exchanges, but they did refute those reports, saying that the topic of a potential meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and U.S. President Joe Biden is not on the agenda this time round. Now, earlier we had seen reports speculating that this meeting may take place if the talks in Alaska went well. We do know that the two leaders have already spoken over the phone last month, and it was speculated that perhaps a meeting may be on the cards, in April around Earth Day to signal that both countries would be willing to work together on climate change, or perhaps even in May in Singapore when the World Economic Forum Summit is being held, or even in October in Italy at the G20 meeting. But it seems that this is not going to be talked about this time round. But China has said it hopes to see relations being restored, somewhat offering of an olive branch, and he's talked about, trying for both sides. It's hope for both sides to focus on areas of common interest, whether it's climate change or potential cooperation in the global economic recovery or in its COVID-19 response. But we do see a difference in approach. China's foreign ministry calling these meetings a high-level strategic dialogue, but the U.S. is saying that this is a one-off meeting and it will depend very much on whether China changes its behavior.
Olivia, thank you very much for that. Olivia Song with that report.
And for a U.S. perspective, Simon Marks joins us live from Washington. So, Simon, no agreement is expected. What exactly are U.S. officials hoping to achieve then?
Well, this is engagement, Atelli. This is the beginning of what US officials say is going to be a long process with the Chinese, both sides engaging in expectations management, the US conceding that there is no possibility at all that you can resolve all the issues that exist between Washington and Beijing in a single meeting. But I think they will welcome the news that the Chinese have now arrived in Anchorage, because there were concerns here that, given some of the language that Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin have used about China over the last few days as they made their way first to Japan, then to South Korea, there was a possibility that the Chinese might say, forget it, we're not showing up for the meeting. So the meetings look set to take place. The Chinese ambassador to the United States last night was very pugnacious in comments that he made to Chinese state media in Anchorage, saying, we will express our position very clearly in this meeting and will not make compromises and concessions in order to create a so-called atmosphere. We will never do that, he said. The United States wants to discuss the whole range of issues that are on the table, including the climate change issue that Olivia referred to, but as well, of course, as America's claim that China is committing genocide in Xinjiang, the ongoing concerns that the United States is expressing over the fate of democracy in Hong Kong, fresh sanctions against Chinese officials announced just a couple of days ago, plus, of course, Taiwan and broader regional issues. So a big, wide-ranging conversation. I mean, that's often a cliche, but it really will be. And the test of the outcome of all of this may well be whether the two sides issue any kind of joint statement. Is there enough that they agree upon at the end of these meetings to issue any kind of a joint statement? Or is this simply the beginning of dialogue that's going to need to continue taking place for weeks and months to come?
Also, Simon, will conversation involve Mr. Blinken perhaps roping China, into dealing with North Korea after, calls for talks were rejected?
Yeah, well, I mean, that exists. That is dependent in part on China's willingness to be roped in, isn't it? I mean, there's no question that the United States, both under President Trump and under President Biden, see China as a very important broker when it comes to North Korea, a country that is uniquely in a position to put pressure on Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang over the nuclear issue and other issues in North Korea's relationship with the rest of the world. But China has disappointed the United States in that regard before. It may well be that the Secretary of State urges the Chinese once again to help America and the world community out in terms of trying to overcome the threat of nuclear development in North Korea. But whether the Chinese, under these current circumstances where some of the language against China on other issues has been pretty aggressive by the US side over the last few days, whether the Chinese agree to accede in that request, I think will be a high bar for this initial meeting. But certainly it's an issue the Americans will want to put on the agenda.